France is literally on fire, and this time it seems to be more serious than ever. The videos coming from there are absolutely insane, and the situation is completely out of control. The death of Nahuel, a 17-year-old Frenchman of Algerian descent, by a shot by the police when he was trying to evade a police control, has sparked a wave of protests that have spread from Nanterre to the entire country, unleashing an outbreak of violence rarely seen in France. The French government has deployed 40,000 police officers to deal with this wave of riots. That has caused hundreds of injuries and arrests. But what is happening in France? Is there something more behind this outburst of anger than the death of the young man? What is the French social reality? Right now, we are going to see it. To understand what is really happening in France, a chronology of events is not enough. We also have to go further and understand the French social structure, which is not an easy task. For this, we are going to take a little tour through history. After the Second World War, France needed a lot of manpower to rebuild the country. And do you know where did it find it? In its colonies, especially in some parts of Morocco and also in Algeria and Tunisia. So many workers from North Africa settled in the European France. This migratory pressure increased when all these countries became independent. Why? Well, when France left North Africa, the economic situation of these new countries was not the best, especially that of Algeria, which had achieved its independence after a bloody war against France. Almost for many Algerians, Tunisians, and Moroccans, going to France to work was a logical step. It was close, they knew how to speak French, and they had historical ties to France. So said and done, the pull effect made millions of immigrants arrive in France during the 50s and 60s. But this was not the end. A new wave of migration arrived in the 1970s and 1980s, after the French government opted for family reunification policies. So many workers who had been in France for years were able to bring their families, however, to no one's surprise. The immigrants who arrived in France generally held the worst jobs, that is, those that the French were not willing to do because they had worse conditions and were less paid. In this way, in France, the so-called banlieues begin to form. The banlieues are neighborhoods located on the periphery of the cities in which certain ethnic or racial groups are concentrated, whose common characteristic is having a foreign origin. These neighborhoods have become true belts of poverty and social marginalization that lack adequate infrastructure, suffer from high crime rates and higher unemployment rates. In fact, many of them have become the territory of different drug mafias that are organizing looting and doing assaults during these protests. However, reducing these protests to the actions of the mafias is being too simplistic. Let's continue with the story. Neighborhood segregation also has important effects on education. Schools in these areas often struggle to provide quality education due to a lack of resources and high teacher turnover rates, as many teachers try to avoid these neighborhoods. This limits the opportunities of the young people who live in these neighborhoods and perpetuates the cycle of poverty and marginalization. In addition to this cocktail, we have to add the plus of stigmatization. Vacant lots in France suffer from a negative stigmatization in society and the media. These are often uniformly portrayed as places of poverty, crime, radicalism, and failure to integrate. This stigmatization can have a very real and negative impact on the lives of people who live in the neighborhoods. It can affect employment opportunities, education, and it can fuel social isolation and exclusion. And above all, it creates the breeding ground perfect for the inhabitants of the neighborhoods to become more and more inbred and only interact with each other. And as if all this were not enough, religious radicalism has also spread like wildfire in these neighborhoods. A radicalism that has been primed with the children of immigrants who, being French, do not feel it, and sometimes they seek in the religious extremism escape from their hatred, something that could be perfectly seen in the thousands of Frenchmen who joined the ranks of ISIS to fight in Syria or Iraq. And finally, we find an extra problem to all this. The proliferation of crime in these neighborhoods has given rise to an incalculable flood of police actions that have polarized many citizens of these neighborhoods and the police themselves. And it is that while the police are tired of having to risk their lives every day in these neighborhoods, They have also been the protagonist of several scandals due to abuse of power or bad practices, and of course, the death of Nahel has been the spark that has lit the fuse. In short, true oases of poverty have been created in these places. Poverty and segregation based on ethnic racial issues have created non-integrated communities with poor education that have resulted in the expansion of religious extremism. Crime and a deep rage against the entire system in which the state, wealthy society, and the police are the enemies of all those who are demonstrating. The situation is completely out of control, and it has been useless that the President of France himself, Emmanuel Macron, has described the actions of the policeman who killed the boy as inexplicable. Nor has it been of any use that the police officer who shot is accused of voluntary manslaughter. The rage of the protesters seems to have no consolation, and the riots continue to be terrible throughout France. The question is, until when? Meanwhile, the mafias continue to contaminate the protests, while religious fundamentalists rub their hands over the number of disgruntled young potentials that could be recruited. As always, from Memorias de Pez, we will continue to report if there are news. While I have a few questions for you, will the French government be able to control the situation? Are the protesters right? See you in the comments if you liked the video. You know that you can like it and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and see you next time.